Dear friends, we'll be starting in about 2 minutes, giving our guests time to join the program. While we're waiting, let me remind everyone that past lectures of the association can be viewed on our YouTube channel that you can access through our website, RussianNobility.org. That's in one word, RussianNobility.org. And this event will be posted at the website in a few days as well. And I hope you had a chance to look at our previous lecture on Kolchak, of which this is a continuation. But if not, do go back to it and look at it again. While we're waiting for things for people to join, I'll say that this is the last event of the season. This was our first season. So I want to thank all the participants and presenters for all of the work in preparation and presenting this information, and for all of you who joined and were interested and submitted questions. We will now take a break for the summer, allowing everybody to enjoy finally the good weather, at least in the north parts of the globe, and for some of our in-person events in May. And we plan to return in September or October for an event on Constantinople, the Russian moment, or 3 years there, which we started to talk about as our second lecture. And then this particular event on immigration to China will continue in 2 consecutive sessions in January and February of next year, with an event each focused on Harbin and another one on Shanghai, where we'll be able to really in-depth examine some of the specific themes of Russian emigre life in those 2 cities. So I think we're now at the 2-minute mark, so we'll start. So once again, I would like to welcome you back to the Russian Nobility Association's virtual lecture and event series focused on themes in Russian history and culture, seeking to provide a fresh perspective on the past and examining ways these events are used today to reshape the present. I'm Alexander Neratov, Vice President of the Association. First of all, so we, in the last lecture on March 27th, we really didn't have enough time to even cover all the material that was available. And we really didn't have enough time to answer the scores of really interesting questions and comments that we received. So we decided to continue our event to present some materials that could not fit into part 1 and to discuss the questions, the great reminiscences and family histories that you, our listeners, have submitted and that deserved to be aired publicly. And 2 of our presenters were able to join us for this, Anatoly Shmelyov and Laurie Manchester. So welcome to that. I will quickly introduce then our first speaker, Anatoly Shmelyov, who's also was just completed and his book called In the Wake of Empire, The Anti-Bolshevik Russia in International Affairs, 1917-1920, was just published in January by Hoover Institution Press. So Anatoly Shmelyov is the Robert Cronquist Curator for Russia and Eurasia and Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, and Project Archivist for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Collection. Anatoly Shmelyov studied history at UCLA and UC Berkeley, MA 1989, and received his PhD from the Institute of Russian History of the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1996. His earlier book, titled The Foreign Policy of Admiral Kolchak's Government, 1918-1919, was published by the European University Press in St. Petersburg in 2017. Please join me in welcoming Anatoly Shmelyov.
Thank you, Alexander, for that kind introduction. So we wanted to get together again with all of you to discuss some of the things that we didn't have a chance to finish up with last time, because after all, we're talking about a fairly brief period in history, just a few years, but very eventful years and really fateful years for Russia and for the 20th century in Europe and in the world in general, because it marked the end of the Russian Empire as we knew it. I mean, the Russian Empire obviously had been taken down in 1917, but there was still a civil war going on in which the heirs of the empire, the whites, tried to continue on Russia's historical path, fighting against the Bolsheviks, but the Bolsheviks achieved victory. And as a result, the course of Russia's history was altered completely. So very eventful years, and obviously impossible to fit them into a brief talk. But nevertheless, we wanted to get back together to finish up with some of the items that we weren't able to discuss last time, as well as the most important thing is to hear out your questions, the questions of the audience, because a lot of you have particular interests and special issues that you wanted to discuss. And certainly I'm more than happy to approach those and try to help answer them if I can. So we pretty much ended with Kolchak's death in February 7th of 1920. But just to reiterate how that took place and then to move on to what happened afterwards, let's go back. Omsk, Kolchak's capital, is evacuated in mid-November of 1919. The war was going badly by this time, and the capital, Omsk, had to be evacuated, and so Kolchak is on a train together with the gold reserve, moving eastwards. And eventually he gets, well, not quite to Irkutsk, but relatively close, and sees that his front has collapsed. And really, there's no further possibility, at least with him in charge, of putting up a resistance. And so on January 4th, 1920, he hands over the leadership of the white movement to General Denikin, who was fighting in southern Russia. And in terms of the local leadership, he hands it over to Ataman Semyonov, Grigory Semyonov, who had been actually his nemesis previously, operating in the Russian Far East, which is to say east of Lake Baikal. Semyonov had caused a lot of problems for Kolchak in terms of supplies that were being sent along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Semyonov was intercepting these trains and taking for himself what he needed and not obeying Kolchak's orders. Nominally, Kolchak was his superior, but for many, many months, in fact, up to the spring of 1919, Semyonov was acting essentially independently of Kolchak. Primarily because Kolchak could do nothing about it. Kolchak was busy with the front. He was busy fighting the Bolsheviks. He had no effective troops in his own rear, as well as the fact that the territory that Semyonov was operating from was largely occupied by Japanese troops, and the Japanese were supporting Semyonov, supporting him even to the extent of supporting him against Kolchak. Later this changed, and when we talk about the foreign policy issues involved, I'll try to explain why. If I forget, or if I don't get to that, then ask me in the question and answer period. But Semyonov, by 1920, Kolchak has no choice. He simply hands over authority to Semyonov on January 4th. And then 10 days later, he is handed over with Allied consent to the revolutionary government in Irkutsk, which promptly hands him over to the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks begin a trial, again, put Kolchak on trial, but the retreating white forces, those which are still more or less organized and available to engage in combat, there's some concern that they might try to free Kolchak. Now, to what extent this concern is really valid or whether it was simply used as an excuse by the Bolsheviks is still open to question. But in the end, the Bolsheviks decide that Kolchak is better off simply dead, and they execute him on February 7th together with his prime minister, Viktor Pepelyaev, and they throw their bodies underneath the ice of the Ushakovka River where it runs into the Angara. And so Kolchak has no grave. Nobody has ever found the body. And he simply is then taken out of the picture by the Bolsheviks. But there are still white forces all around, and they're evacuating to the extent possible. Now we're talking about February 1920. January, February are the coldest months in Russia and definitely in Siberia. And so these troops, to the extent that they're able to evacuate, have to find their way across Lake Baikal to make it to the safer region on the eastern side, the region that's occupied by Japanese troops and other intervention forces, as well as under the control of Ataman Semyonov. To get to the other side of Lake Baikal, well, fortunately, the lake is frozen, and so they're able to cross, but nevertheless, it's a horrendous journey. One of the leading figures in the white movement after Kolchak, General Vladimir Kapel, falls through the ice at one point, not on Lake Baikal, but in another part of the journey, and ultimately dies of the illness sustained as a result of this fall into the icy water. So the ice and the cold are really the greatest enemies of the Russians, as well as hunger, and of course the inability to find transportation, because the railway is all blocked up with evacuating troops, and the Allies are putting the Czechs in the evacuation line first over the Russians. And as a result, the Czech and Slovak legions, we had talked about those last time, they are evacuating in the first order. The gold reserve eventually falls also into the hands of the Bolsheviks, and I think there's going to be a question after that, after I speak about its fate. So I'll just stop there at this moment, but later on we'll return to that. So the troops cross over Lake Baikal or go around Lake Baikal. Some of them take a more southerly route and enter into Mongolia, into Manchuria. Eventually, the troops all have to abandon Chita and the Transbaikal province because Semyonov is unable to hold out. The Red Army is advancing. It's definitely more powerful than Semyonov is able to put up a resistance to. And as a result, even Semyonov and his troops, together with the remaining troops of the White Armies coming from the west, are forced to abandon the Transbaikal province and enter into Manchuria, where some of them settle in Harbin, but others eventually make their way even further east to the maritime provinces, and in particular to Vladivostok and the region surrounding Vladivostok. Because what happens in the Far East after the collapse of the White Movement and the death of Admiral Kolchak is that several governments are installed in the major cities of the Far East. These are Chita, Verkhnyoudinsk, Blagoveshchensk, and Khabarovsk, and of course Vladivostok. Now, the main government that we should focus on is the government of the Far Eastern Republic. And the Far Eastern Republic is not a white government in any sense of the word. It's actually a pro-Bolshevik government, but it is not the Bolshevik government. In other words, it's not an arm of the government in Moscow, technically. In reality, it is, but what was going on was that Lenin and the Bolsheviks were very worried about provoking Japan, because again, Japan was the major occupying power in the Russian Far East, and the Bolsheviks in Moscow did not wish to provoke Japan and to cause a full-scale conflict with Japan, because they understood that they would lose this conflict, that the Japanese were simply much more capable, much more efficient, much more organized, much more prepared, and better trained, better armed, and able to crush any troops of the Red Army that would enter into the Far Eastern provinces. So instead, they created what was called the Far Eastern Republic, which were basically pro-Bolshevik forces with their own army, the People's Army of the region. And these were supposed to be sort of a buffer state and a buffer army that would keep Western Siberia and Bolshevik Russia, separate from the Japanese, who were still primarily occupying the farther ends of the Far East. So that's the Far Eastern Republic based in Verkhnyoudinsk. Again, Semyonov abandons Chita, and there are also a couple of regimes in these other towns, Khabarovsk and Blagoveshchensk, but they're not of any great significance. They really only control the town, even if that, and not much of the hinterland. So these regimes are socialist in orientation, just as the regime in Vladivostok is, but they are not Bolshevik as such. So they're led by Mensheviks or by socialist revolutionaries, but they're not quite yet Bolshevized. But the Bolshevik influence through the Far Eastern Republic is great in these towns as well, as it is in Vladivostok. And ultimately, this causes significant problems in Vladivostok, which is to say the Japanese are still occupying this region. They're still in control, especially of the maritime province, where Vladivostok is, of course, the major city. And they tolerate for a while the socialist government there. But there are constant issues and difficulties that crop up. And well, to cut a long story short, basically in May of 1921, so this is well over a year later, there is a coup that takes place in Vladivostok where the Merkulov brothers, Spiridon and Nikolai, supported by the Japanese, take over the running of the town and of its hinterland in the maritime region, and they essentially become the government up until the ultimate evacuation of Vladivostok about a year and a half later. So, and these are not socialists, so they are closer in orientation. Well, you know, I guess capitalist, if you want to put that kind of opposition to it. But basically, they're not a socialist government; they're a conservative government. And the general in charge of troops, General Dieterichs, is also very well. He's a very interesting individual in and of himself. But basically, he tries to cobble together an army based on the troops who had previously evacuated through, well, following the ice march of the White Army across Lake Baikal or around Lake Baikal and then into Manchuria. And these were two really disparate forces. One were the forces of Ataman Semyonov, several thousand men ready and willing to fight, who settled in the maritime region, but around the border station of Grodekovo, which is basically essentially right on the border of Manchuria or China and the maritime region, Russian territory. And then there were also well over 10,000 men who had evacuated, who were part of Kolchak's army, who had also evacuated to Manchuria. And these were led by General Viktorin Molchanov, who had commanded previously the Izhevsk and Votkinsk divisions composed of workers who were in the White Army. And so he is in charge of these forces, and they are located primarily a little bit northerly of Vladivostok. And they're the ones who try to engage the Bolsheviks in battle to defend this territory, this sort of last outpost of the White movement in Russia. But they don't get a lot of Japanese support in this. The Japanese are still occupying the region, but they are already understanding that the chances of them holding on to it are very slim, for various reasons, some of them internal Japanese domestic reasons, others international reasons, pressure from other countries, the United States, and various others that the Japanese occupation and even worse, annexation of these regions would not be tolerated by the international community. So ultimately, the Japanese decide to evacuate these regions which they do in October of 1922. And this leaves the Russians alone to face the Bolsheviks, or the army of the Far Eastern Republic, the People's Army, which they are unable to match forces because obviously they don't have the weapons, they don't have the supplies. And after many years of civil war and all the losses that were suffered, they are also to a degree demoralized. And so they end up evacuating Vladivostok also in October of 1922, together with the fleet, or the remains of the fleet, the Pacific Fleet of the Russian Navy, which leaves Vladivostok also in October. In my previous slide from my previous presentation, I had mentioned November. That's not, well, that's accurate to the degree that there were still white troops left over in the far north in the Kamchatka Peninsula. And so these evacuate in November of 1922. So this is when essentially the whites evacuate Russia completely. But even that's not the end of the Civil War, because there is the mission of what we know of as the 700 Argonauts, who were troops under General Anatoly Pepelyaev, also who had been previously evacuated. And in late 1922, they actually re-enter Russia through the Sea of Okhotsk, one of the ports, the small ports there, and they try to reignite the Civil War, hoping that all of the anti-Bolshevik local peasant uprisings in the region that had been taking place from 1920, 1921, 1922 would, with some military backing, be able to create a force that would coalesce around these troops and hopefully restart the Civil War and bring it to actually a white victory. Well, unfortunately, these 700 Argonauts traveled to Okhotsk and within Yakutia over the winter. It was horrible, but they were eventually beaten by local Red forces. Most of them surrendered. Just a few managed to escape to the Japanese island of Hokkaido in 1923. And essentially, this would be called the end of the Civil War, even though it wasn't the end of all sorts of uprisings and further activity in the Far East, because there were still a lot of unhappy people out there. So, if you like, you could end the Civil War there. If you like, you could actually say that it continued on in the form of various underground movements and uprisings. Well, at any rate, another topic that I didn't get to in the course of my talk last time was white foreign policy. I did want to touch on that because I just wrote a book about it. So I wanted to sort of use this opportunity for shameless self-promotion and talk a little bit about foreign policy, because it is an important factor in everything that was going on here. Why the whites? I mean, a lot of people had written about Bolshevik-Western relations because the Bolsheviks won the Civil War, and everybody was interested to know what their foreign policy was based on, what their relations with the Allies were, how these began with the Allies, with the Western powers, I should say, were how these began and how they came to influence things later on. Well, I'll have to cut this one short too because I'm running out of time. But basically, foreign policy for the whites focused on three factors or three goals. One was recognition of the white governments. This was never achieved. Why was it necessary? For a number of reasons. Some of them being domestic. For example, one of the reasons why Ataman Semyonov was able to oppose Kolchak was that Kolchak was unrecognized. And so he had kind of moral authority to say, well, Kolchak has no recognition, and therefore I have authority in my region, and I'm going to do what I like. So this is one of the domestic reasons why recognition was necessary. But there are also international reasons to open up the previous lines of credit that the Imperial Russian government and the provisional government had received in order to buy arms and equipment to supply the army to fight the Bolsheviks. This was another important reason for recognition. And of course, the moral authority that it would bestow on the Kolchak government. The other issue that was involved was maintaining Russian territorial integrity, but we talked about this more last time, and we used the example of Finland as the most important of these issues that were involved in maintaining Russian territorial integrity. And the third reason for, or rather the third goal of white foreign policy was aid. Aid in the form of Allied intervention, but Allied intervention could take two forms. One form was the involvement of foreign troops on Russian territory to help fight the Bolsheviks. The other form was strictly aid in military supplies, equipment, and arms. And it was really the second form of aid that was the more important for the whites, because the first form of aid, actual Allied intervention, ended up causing an enormous amount of friction and problems with all of the foreign troops that were involved on Russian territory. There was friction with the Czechs. There was friction with the Japanese, because there was always this feeling of danger that what the Japanese really wanted were access to Russian markets, and of course, in particular to the raw materials that Siberia was so rich with. So this was one of the reasons why there was always a danger associated with Japanese intervention that would turn into occupation and annexation. And Kolchak's government and the governmental officials worried a great deal about this, as well as military officials, of course. Then there was the role of U.S. troops. The U.S. had about 9,000 men at most in Siberia, well, in the Far East at its height. The Japanese had well over 70,000. We don't know exactly how many, but because the numbers changed, and some of these were, of course, in the zone of the Chinese Eastern Railway, those figures have been taken as high as I've seen 90,000. So 10 times as many as U.S. troops. Other countries had troops as well. Even the Chinese troops were present. There were British troops, there were French troops, about 700 of those, 15 or 1600 British troops were present. So really it's the Japanese who played the major role. The United States troops played the secondary role, but there was also always a lot of friction with these troops. And so it was really military supplies that the Russians wanted to focus on. And these had to be purchased because the government was unrecognized. So it was difficult to get lines of credit. So they had to be purchased for the gold that Kolchak had in his hands. Well, with that, I think I'll end because we really want to get to questions and other issues now. So if you have any questions about this, let's discuss it a little bit further down the line. So thank you.
Thank you, Anatole. This was very dense in new information, and it's just amazingly a complicated period to examine. So first of all, as far as the question and answers, the question answers function will be accessed. There's a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and that is now live. So please submit your questions, and our moderator will read the questions. So I'd like to welcome back Sofia Kishkovskaya today as our moderator for the question and answer period. Sofia Kishkovskaya is a well-known reporter based in Moscow since 1991, writing on political and cultural issues for the New York Times and the Art newspaper. So we will take some questions for Anatole in this period for maybe 15 minutes or so. And then we'll have our second presentation, and then we'll open it up to a more general question and answer periods after that. So, Sonia, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you once again for yet another excellent presentation. It is amazing how many questions we received last time, and we're actually going to come back to a few of those because they're very important, I think, for everyone to hear the answers to this. And one is of particular interest to me since it was actually related to the question that I asked last time. In Russia today, one thing that one often hears about the white forces, about Admiral Kolchak, is about their cruelty, about the white terror, obviously things did happen, but the question that we received that I think is very good to address now, Anatole, would be about Baron von Unger and Sternberg. So a listener wrote in after the March 27th lecture that you mentioned Simulanov, but did not mention then Roman von Unger and Sternberg, who commanded the first group of Siberians and then headed the Buryat Mongol groups who fought the Bolsheviks in Siberia. And this listener's question is, to what extent was the extreme cruelty reported of both of these renegade leaders to civilian populations by their largely non-Russian troops and their opposition to Kolchak lead to the defeat of the white cause?
All right. Well, yeah, these are very important issues. So here's the problem. Ataman Semyonov, Ataman Kalmikov in the Ussuri region, and let's see, Unger and Sternberg, very colorful figures, but also figures who, unsavory figures, let's put it that way. General William Graves, the commander of the US American Expeditionary Force in Siberia, said that the only difference between Semyonov and Kalmikov was that Semyonov ordered others to do his killing for him, whereas Kalmikov killed people with his own hands. These are people who, junior military officers essentially, who rose through sort of this bubbling cauldron of the revolution to the top. Ordinarily, they would never have made the rank of general, probably not even of colonel. But yet, in the revolutionary moment, it was certain qualities, or maybe quality is too nice a word, but certain aspects of their character that brought them to the fore. And I guess the fact that they stopped at nothing was probably the primary aspect of character that brought them out. And what they did essentially was that they looked at anybody who was unhappy or dissatisfied with any aspect of what was going on as Bolsheviks. And simply everything to them was black and white. And if you weren't for them, then you were against them. And if you were against them, then you had to be eliminated. And so this was the way that they conducted their affairs in the regions that they controlled. And this was also pretty much what Unger and von Sternberg did, with a major difference that Unger and von Sternberg, the most colorful of these characters, he actually had an ideology in place, which was that I guess you could consider him a convert to Buddhism, and he wanted to reestablish the empire of Genghis Khan from the territory of Mongolia over the Russian Far East, and so on and so forth. So this appears to have been this idea that he had, that he tried to put into action, and he also stopped at nothing to put it into place. And even the memoirs of those who participated in as juniors or subordinates to these people disclose some of the horrors that were committed by these men. Really unfortunate, and of course totally counterproductive, because if you're unhappy, it doesn't mean that you're opposed. But if you're unhappy and you are whipped or you're killed, then all of your friends and relatives suddenly become aware that something really bad is going on. And so as a result, for every one of these people who were killed by Ungern or by Semyonov or by the others, tens and hundreds of people are going to start questioning, why should we be supporting this movement? So this is the problem. And yes, definitely it was very counterproductive, and none of this should have been allowed to happen.
So did it contribute to the loss of the white forces, to their loss in the Civil War?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because the people who then became dissatisfied, they started to join the partisan or guerrilla movements around there, and these movements grew to something, well, several 100,000. I think the estimates are up to 200,000 men involved in various anti-white partisan formations in the Russian Far East and in Siberia. And that doesn't even go into the number of people who were mobilized and deserted, or the number of people who were mobilized and then switched to the Reds because they thought, well, if the white movement is this bad, then certainly we should try the Reds. And so all of this sort of snowballs as a result. So definitely it was a major contributing factor to the defeat of the white movement in the East.
Thank you very much for that, because it does come up very often, I find, in Russia today. I have one general question in that regard, then I'll move on. We are receiving specific questions to you, and especially about the military, so I will get to those. But I wonder if you, as a historian and someone who studies the military and studied the Russian Civil War so closely, and do you find, when you're listening to news in the world today and in general, when you hear about civil wars, do they all in the end up sounding alike? It's sort of like the reverse of Tolstoy, that unhappy families are actually all alike rather than happy families, because it sounds so much, all these divisions, like what we hear about Syria and other countries. And do you find that when you read about and study civil wars?
Well, to a degree, I mean, you know, it's always a danger to use analogies, especially when you're talking about more distant periods. But then again, everybody does refer to the past, and for obvious reasons, that the past is our really our only guide to where we are now. So, so you have to be very careful with drawing analogies, and you have to be very mindful of the great differences that are involved in any civil war. But at the same time, there are obviously similarities, and so it's just important to distinguish them. There's a great book by David Armitage called Civil Wars, and it's certainly worth consulting, because there's also the question of what is a civil war? How do you define a civil war? I mean, we all think we know what we mean when we talk about a civil war, but do we really? What is a civil war? How is it different from an uprising or an insurrection, or something of this nature? There's also a great book by Jonathan Smeal, a British historian, called The Russian Civil Wars, in which he wants to expand the definition of the Russian Civil War to cover a lot of different things. In fact, he begins the Russian Civil War in 1916, even before the Bolshevik overthrow. Why? Because he begins to trace it from an uprising in Central Asia against the imperial government, which had wanted to mobilize the population there, and how this fed into the revolution and then into the Civil War that we're talking about, and then how this continued up until the mid-1920s. So that definition of civil war is very broad, much broader than the period that we're talking about. I mean, I'm focusing on the period of the struggle of the white armies, which is a more narrow definition of civil war. So it's all a question of definitions too. This is one of the things that distinguishes the humanities from the hard sciences, is that it's very much how you define things is how you end up talking about them. And that's why there's a lot of controversy, is because people are talking about the same thing, but defining it differently.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for those book recommendations. And thank you, actually, you have addressed one of the first questions that came in our chat about the Central Asia uprisings and whether they qualify for a continuation of the Civil War. So it's a complex question and answer that you've given. So we have another question. Based on all of your terrific research, historical research, would you count the Basmachi resistance as part of the overall white effort or its own conflict? I realize this is a matter of opinion.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it goes back to our talk last month, where I mentioned that the so-called democratic counter-revolution of 1918 should be differentiated from the white movement as such, because the whites, self-defined, were trying to lead Russia to sort of reestablishing it in its historical context. Whereas these other movements, the Basmachi movement or the Finnish White Guard, they had their own purposes. So they were anti-Bolshevik, but they weren't white, and they weren't affiliated with the whites, and they didn't support the Russian white cause at any rate. I mean, even General Mannerheim, the leader of the Finnish White Guards, even he had issues with the Russian whites that prevented him from participating fully in the Russian Civil War on the side of the whites. And the Basmachi are, one would probably be closer to defining them as independence fighters or freedom fighters for their own regions, rather than as representatives of any white movement of that nature. So it's again, it's a question of definition. So they're anti-Bolshevik, but they're not white.
Thank you. So both in this talk and the previous one, of course, what's very interesting is the extent to which the world was tied into what was happening in Russia in the Civil War, both Asia and the European powers and the US. So we have a question right now related to the US. A listener asks, my grandfather was part of the US Marines who went to Russia in 1918 to assist the whites. I'm wondering where they served. I actually have a medal given to him by Admiral Kolchak. Do you know the major regions in which the US troops fought?
Okay, yeah, great question. So there were two major regions. One was northern Russia, and the other was in the Russian Far East. Now, if the medal was from Admiral Kolchak, then it was definitely the Russian Far East. I have to say, I haven't had a chance to really focus on the intervention issues. In the north, US troops actually fought the Bolsheviks directly, together with the British. There were several offensives that took place in late 1918, 1919, where troops were actually in firefights with the Bolsheviks. In the Russian Far East, that generally was, well, not even generally, that wasn't the case, at least not directly with the Bolsheviks. There were conflicts with the partisans, the guerrillas, but not with the Red Army as such. And it's important to note, we talk about this figure of 9,000 US troops present in the Russian Far East, but what were the casualties like? I believe the number is actually something like 27 US troops killed in the course of the intervention in the Far East. And 25 of those, if I'm not mistaken, are in one battle where simply a Red guerrilla force overwhelmed a small force of Americans who had camped, had chosen a poor place to camp in a small sort of valley where they could be, shot at from both sides of the hills, and so this is why they suffered so many casualties. So many, 25, 27, 20, well, basically less than 30 killed for the entire length of the American expeditionary of the participation of the American Expeditionary Force in Siberia is just a tiny number. And so when we talk about the intervention, certainly the Soviets throughout their history and their propaganda campaigns, they made so much of foreign intervention and how horrible it was and so on and so forth. But with these tiny figures of casualties, you can see that it's not as big a deal as they paint it. But it was hugely effective in their propaganda. So hopefully, I see there's another question about the French role. There were not many Frenchmen in Siberia. There was a major French intervention on the coast of the Black Sea in southern Russia that was very unsuccessful, and the French eventually evacuated with a huge loss of face in southern Russia. But there were very few French in Siberia and in the Russian Far East, except that General Maurice Jeannin, who commanded the French troops, he was a particularly signal figure. Now, what happened was, late in 1918, he was appointed commander-in-chief of all of the Allied forces in Siberia. The idea being, at that point, to reestablish the Russian front against Germany, and also that there were so many Czechs and other Allied forces there. There were Polish legionnaires, there were Romanian legionnaires, there were others, and so General Jeannin was given orders that he was supposed to pull together all these troops and be their commander-in-chief. But by the time that he arrived, the situation was totally different. Number one, Admiral Kolchak's government was in place and in sort of general control of the area. Number two, the war had ended. Number three, the Russians obviously didn't want to have a foreign general in charge of their troops, and so Jeannin comes in with the idea that he's going to be the major figure there, and suddenly, and also the British are already in place with General Knox, and suddenly he finds that he's in a position where he's unable to establish himself, and he's unhappy with the role that he eventually plays, which is sort of commander-in-chief of the Allied troops, with the exception of the Russians, which means that he's commander basically of the Czechs and of the Poles and of some other small, really tiny legionary units, and he becomes a sort of non-essential figure, as opposed to what he really wanted to do there and the role that he really wanted to play. And I think this really affected him in his memoirs, as he becomes very averse to Kolchak, who sort of, rained on his parade. And you can feel this in his writings. And ultimately, the role that he plays is that he sanctions the fact that Kolchak is given over to the revolutionary government in Irkutsk and ultimately killed by the Bolsheviks. So he's really essentially responsible for this decision in the end.
Thank you so much. And I understand it's now time for us to go over to Laurie to hear her presentation.
Yes. So thank you, Anatol. Again, absolutely fascinating. And this last story about the French involvement in the last stage, it's the first time I'm hearing this. It's really sad. So a reminder again, the question and answer, send your questions in and we will go back to them. And I'm sure there'll be other questions for Anatol. But right now, let's switch to our second presenter. Laurie Manchester is an associate professor of history at Arizona State University and the author of Holy Fathers, Secular Sons, Clergy, Intelligentsia, and the Modern Self in Revolutionary Russia. She received her PhD in history from Columbia University. The book Laurie Manchester is presently writing, From China to the Soviet Union, The Return of the True Russians, is based on her work in 20 archives and nearly 100 oral interviews with repatriates and emigres from China. We hope to hear more about her work next year in January, February, like we said, when we focus an entire event on the Russian immigration in intra-war China. So please join me in welcoming back Laurie Manchester.
Thank you so very much. Okay, I do have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to try to share my screen. Can everyone see it? Yes, yes, I'm assuming. Give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. Okay, terrific. I'm not a master of technology. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the end of Russian Harbin, about what choices Harbinsi had once they realized that they had to leave Harbin. And I'm also going to talk about the creation and workings of the Harbin global diaspora. As far as I know, within the Russian diaspora, Harbinsi are the only group that have formed their own diaspora within a diaspora based on where they were from and their third or their second displacement from their place of exile. Okay, all right, I'm going to make this look a little better. There we go. Okay, so as I talked about last time, in 1945, when the Red Army liberated Manchuria from the Japanese, Russian emigre Harbin, to a large extent, ceased to function. In 1946, Russian emigres were given the chance to take out Soviet citizenship, and the vast majority did, 80% did. Now, this was not because the majority of them were communists, far from it. There were three basic reasons why they took out Soviet citizenship. One was because many of them had been stateless the entire time they'd been in China, and this was the first time they had a state to protect them. And already they were realizing things were precarious for them in China. Second, when the Red Army came into Manchuria, all emigre schools were closed. Soviet schools were open. So if you wanted your child to get a Russian language education, the only choice you had was to have them study in a Soviet school, and you had to be a Soviet citizen. Third, to work at a Soviet enterprise or institution or a Chinese state institution or organization, you had to be a Soviet citizen. And as time went on, the Chinese and the Soviets were the main employers in China, although I do want to note that Russian businesses continued to function, private businesses, until 1959. If you wonder where the 20% who didn't take out Soviet citizenship were employed. Now, Manchurian Russians were not allowed to repatriate until 1954. They started asking about repatriating as soon as the Red Army came in. Some of them did, and they were told that they were not ready. They were not ready to repatriate and that they would have to wait. When finally the right to return was announced in 54, they had no idea that this decision was coming. So they were really, those who wanted to go home and considered the Soviet Union their home were sort of waiting and had no idea when and if they'd be allowed home. By the early 1950s, the vast majority of Russians in China realized that they needed to leave. The Chinese were asserting their control culturally, but also Russians were losing their jobs to Chinese. By 1955, 80% of Russians in Manchuria were unemployed. Now, the question is, what kinds of choices did Harbinsi have? And really, when we talk about choices, we have to ask when. And because it was a dynamic situation in which laws were changing and the ability to get visas or the ability to get exit visas were changing. So after the tragic repatriation of 1935 to 37, no one could repatriate, with a few exceptions, until 1954. Now, between 45 and 54, and of course, before World War II, Harbinsi could migrate to capitalist countries, and they could again after 1957. It's important to note that between 1954 and 57, so right after the right to return was announced in 54, and then when Chinese-Soviet relations sour in 57, the Chinese government, following instructions from their big brother, the Soviet communist state, allowed very few migrants to leave the country, very few Harbinsi. They did not give them exit visas, and that was because the Soviet Union wanted as many as possible to repatriate. Now, the country that most of them wanted to go to was the United States, and yet, as we know from tight immigration laws in the US, it was a very difficult country to get to, especially if you did not have family members. So if you had immediate family members, they could sponsor you. In some cases, you could get there with sponsorship from non-family members. Australia was easier to get to. Australia, one needed to simply have sponsors who would sponsor you there. Now, those who wanted to come to the US were told by the US consulate in Hong Kong that if they went for 5 years to a third country, such as a country in South America, they could then reapply after 5 years there and come to the US, and many did that. Now, why this 5-year quota? That was because they were white, but they were seen as white Chinese. Chinese had to wait 10 years. And what's important to note here is that the white Russians in China were not considered DPs. The privileges extended to the DPs did not extend to them. And for those born in China, and many of the younger generation were, they were seen as Chinese, although we do see the US made a distinction between white Chinese and ethnic Chinese. Now, the easiest countries to get to were in South America, but at times, South American countries had different regulations. For example, Brazil and Argentina, which were the most popular countries to go to at one point, each one of them wouldn't take people over 50 years old. There were other times when they wouldn't take single women. Waiting for the visas took time. One had to have documents translated. The World Council of Churches helped, and they paid for transportation from Hong Kong to the country one was migrating to, and then you had to pay them back. I do want to just make one note, which is that in the late 50s and early 60s, there were a number of elderly Harbinsi who wanted to leave, and there were a few nursing homes in France and Belgium who were willing to take them and pay for them to go. Now, in 1954, and this is a picture of a parish where the parish had decided these members of the parish were about to repatriate. In 1954, this raskol, this horrible split happens among Harbinsi. And that is because on Easter Sunday in 1954, the Soviet consulate sent representatives to churches throughout Manchuria to announce after the service that the right to return had been granted. And immediately, families start arguing, friends start arguing. Now, not only were extended families ripped apart and friends ripped apart, but actual nuclear families were also divided, with the spouses arguing so intensely that in some cases the wife would take the daughters to Australia and the husband would take the sons and go to the Soviet Union. The pattern that I've been able to find when there was such intense arguments within a family is the spouse who was from a Starozhili family born in China, who had never been to Russia, was often dead set on returning to Russia, to their historic homeland, whereas the spouse who had lived through the Civil War and had spent some time in Soviet Russia did not want to go. And really the main division between the two groups of those who wanted to repatriate and those who would not was whether they considered the USSR Russia. And I can talk more during the Q&A about the reasons behind repatriating, which I touched on last time. I do want to note that there were real advantages to repatriation in that families were given 3,000 rubles startup money. They were given free transportation to the Soviet Union from wherever they lived in China. And also they were allowed to bring as much baggage as they wanted. And in some cases, families took tons of baggage. Every single piece of furniture that they owned, they bought clothes for their children for any kind of growth spurt could accommodate for any kind of size, and brought back tons and tons of material, which actually turned out to be very handy because they were able to sell some of that in the first few years when life was hardest in the Soviet Union for them. Now, a really interesting group are the waverers, those who did not go anywhere for a couple of years, and those who were really sort of sitting on the fence trying to decide if they wanted to repatriate and or if they wanted to go to a third country, because remember, of course, the family had originally come from Russia. And here I have a letter up here, which is an example of many letters that I've collected and read in archives written by Harbinsi, two friends in the Soviet Union, two friends in Australia, and that they received from their friends. Now, a question I often get asked is, did the repatriates in the 1950s know the fates of those who had gone in 35, the vast majority of them killed or arrested in 37? And the fact of the matter is that if they wanted to, they knew. What do I mean by that? I mean that the Emigrated press in the 1930s, late 1930s, printed what had happened. In one case I know of, and I have the letters, a sister received letters from her brother who was in the Gulag, and she was living in Harbin. Many people heard the tales that were passed on orally, but there were some families who did not want to believe it. For example, one mother whose daughter I interviewed, two of her sons had gone in 35, and she refused to believe they were dead, and indeed repatriated in 54, hoping to see them again. And there were others who also refused to believe what had happened. Now, families, when they repatriated and they were leaving behind family members who were too frightened to go, agreed to write in code from the USSR. And sometimes these codes are impossible to break because they were unique to families. In other cases, they would refer to family members who had been buried in Harbin and say that, Uncle Petya is waiting for you, please do come, which meant don't come. But surprisingly, some wrote quite openly. We know this because the KGB did collect letters from those who went and wrote back to China for the first couple of years. And some of those letters have been released, and they emphatically say, do not come. I want to come back to China. This is a terrible place. Now, of course, not all repatriates felt that way, and I think a lot of it depends on the degree of enthusiasm, but also in terms of what their expectations were, right? So there were white army officers who emigrated with their children or repatriated with their children or grandchildren who were terrified and thought that they were going to be shot on the border, or there were rumors that all repatriates would be sent to the Gulag. So when they got there and nothing happened to them, and this wave of repatriation, no one was arrested, they were relieved, and they wrote back saying everything's absolutely fine. So if that was your expectation, then of course you were not disappointed. What's interesting are the questions that they asked Harbinsi who have gone to Australia and South America. They're very concerned, these waivers, about their fear that they're going to end up working in jungles, working in the outback, doing manual labor for their entire life. Also, a real resistance to wanting to learn another language, since they had only needed Russian in Harbin. And one thing that they really don't like when they hear back from Buenos Aires or from Sydney is that Harbinsi live far from each other in these cities. So they're not able to replicate Harbin in a way that they were in San Francisco to some extent, but of course the US being so difficult to get to. Some were waivers because they didn't want to go. In 1954-55, you had to go to the state farms. That was how Khrushchev got this whole repatriation movement going, and they knew that they would not prosper, that they could not do farm work under those conditions, and so they waited until that was over. And it was by 56, and you could go by private invitation, but from a family member or friend. But some gave up in that period of 54 to 56, waiting they had a visa to Brazil or a visa to Australia, but they could not get the exit visa. And some gave up and repatriated, fearful they would never be allowed out, because of course they didn't know that Chinese-Soviet relations would sour. There was, of course, a famine in Harbin and in Manchuria in China in the late 1950s. And interestingly, friends and relatives were sent food by relatives who had repatriated in 54. Also, the Soviet consulate, which was open until 1962, brought in not only Soviet citizens, but also sometimes stateless Russians, and gave them food during this difficult time. And that won over some who decided then to repatriate. Now, once Harbinsi migrate to outside of China to capitalist countries, and even those in the Soviet Union as well, they never really assimilate fully into the Russian emigre diasporas that they join, right? They stay somewhat separate. And this is a photograph of a church that was founded in Melbourne in 1965, where the priest was from Harbin, and at least from the church's history, it's noted that all of the parishioners were from Harbin. So even in churches, there was sometimes this urge to stay separate. The homesickness that Harbinsi feel for Harbin starts as soon as they leave, and it doesn't matter where they go. They have it and they retain it. That is this intense nostalgia. They don't feel that they have a lot in common with Russians who have not lived in Harbin. In Australia, for example, in the first few years, young people tended to marry their fellow Russians, but in the case of Australia, they tended to marry their fellow Harbinsi, and they kept in touch with each other throughout the entire world. Harbinsi dominate the emigre press in San Francisco and Australia, where they live in large numbers. They were seen, especially in Australia, they were seen as red by displaced persons who came before them, because they had been Soviet citizens in some cases, but also because Soviet culture had become, in part, the culture of Russian Harbin after 45. Young people were used to going to see Russian language Soviet movies. They loved seeing movies in their native language. And the only place they could go to see those movies in Australia was to go to the Soviet club. And so they went to the Soviet club, and again, were seen as suspects. So some tension that is there. Now, there was contact between repatriates and Harbinsi who stayed abroad, went to Australia, went to South America before the fall of the Soviet Union. This is a photograph of a repatriate in Krasnoyarsk, Krasnodar, being visited by her nieces and sister and being taken on a lovely cruise to Yalta, and this was in the early 1970s. There were visits back and forth if they could get visas, visits from repatriates to visit their family members and vice versa. There was a lot of correspondence, mainly the older generation. Younger people were often frightened because of their jobs, and some were told explicitly not to by Soviet officials. The older generation usually just refused to listen to that. Harbinsi abroad sent packages, which very much helped the living standards of repatriates. And some repatriates actually were able to emigrate and join immediate family members, especially in Australia, where most Harbinsi went. And this happens in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. I also want to note, however, that some Harbinsi who emigrated to Australia and Brazil repatriated beginning in the 1960s. Okay, after the fall of the USSR, we see that the global Harbin diaspora unites. And this is a photograph from the conference that was held in 1998 in Moscow on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Kavajade Railroad. And over 300 Harbinsi from all over the world and, of course, repatriates attended. The problem is the specter of 1954 haunts them to some extent. I would say that many on both sides, those who repatriated and those who didn't, feel sorry for each other. They don't fully understand each other. Harbinsi during the Soviet period were able to get smuggled memoirs that were written in the West, and often emigre Harbinsi would write that they all were arrested and that no one ever heard from them again, which was absolutely not the truth. Generally, they get into sort of these age-old arguments sometimes about how, and the repatriates will say, well, we have culture, our grandchildren all got a higher education and went on to graduate school, whereas those Harbinsi in Australia will talk about or are perceived by repatriates as only talking about the great material wealth, the number of cars they have, the houses. So this sort of age-old association of the West with greater wealth, but Russia with culture. Harbinsi who go to Australia are often very surprised that the grandchildren of Harbinsi, the second generation born in Australia, do not speak Russian fluently. They argue, well, look, we did it in Harbin, why can't they? And again, that question of language or religion. So the Harbinsi and who repatriated have preserved the Russian language. Of course, their grandchildren do speak Russian, but a difference is that those that emigrated abroad have retained a greater sense of Russian Orthodoxy, especially since the church is the main home of the diaspora, whereas many Harbinsi during the Soviet period did not openly practice their religion. A few repatriates have emigrated since the fall of the Soviet Union, but some who did have the opportunity to, visiting family, chose not to. One encouraging sign that shows that it really is a global diaspora is that the repatriate press, which burgeons in the early 1990s, and again is the only emigre press that I know of whereby it's connected to just Russians from one country. They start reprinting articles by Harbinsi written all over the world and letters to the editor, and all of this serves as a forum that connects them, as do school reunions that informally existed throughout the Soviet period, but now exist with Harbinsi abroad coming to visit. This has led some Harbinsi to see themselves as their own ethnicity or tribe. And lastly, I'm going to end here with a ball, and this is a photograph of some of the people who attended that ball. It was several hundred that united the global Harbinsi from all over the world, including Russia, in 2009. And the ball was organized by a Harbinets who emigrated to Australia in the early 60s, Nikolai Zaika, who in 2004 was able to get his grandfather's house back from the Chinese government. He was able to actually take possession of it, get it as private property, and he held from 2004 till his health deteriorated in 2012 a museum of Russian Harbin, and many Harbinsi from all over the world who visited Harbin would visit him at that museum, and he was a wonderful host to all of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurie. I think we're waiting for Alexander, but maybe I'll then, oh, there he is, okay.
But thank you, Laurie. And I've had some computer problems here. Thank you, Laurie. So yes, we are getting many questions on specifically the subject of Harbin. So Sophia, let's launch right into them.
Yes, well, I believe that in Laurie's talk, she did address some of the questions that have come up about how people made their decision to go back and about the fears of what would happen with the KGB, the Gulag, and so forth. You addressed that in detail, but there are some very specific questions. So if I might, I'll go right into those. And they also touch on our favorite issue of archives and what happens to them. So you said that the KGB collected letters of people from Harbin who left in 1935 and
no 54.
54, okay. Yes, I guess then the question that was misunderstood and that was sent to Harbin. In any case, in 1954, we'll address it from that point of view. Where can one see or have access to those letters? Or is that one of those situations with Russian archives where unless you are a relative, you cannot see these archives?
Yeah, there might have been some confusion because I did mention that there are letters that were written from a brother who was arrested in 37 to his sister back in Harbin. Those are in a private family archive. Those have not, I've been able to see them, but they're not open to researchers. I encourage, in terms of the KGB, yes, collected these. They were only interested, they weren't interested in what repatriates wrote to each other. They were interested in what they were writing to Harbin. Those letters, unfortunately, they are in Russian archives. I was given a Xerox of a report written about them, written at the time, and by a Russian who had had access to them in the 1990s. And in Ekaterinburg, and those are not open. There is, however, if anyone's interested, I can send you, there was an article that an archivist, and it might be in Perm, who wrote, she herself wrote an article that's on the archives website about these letters and what she found in them. So to my knowledge, nobody besides her has actually looked at them, but she quotes from them. It's very instructive. I have an archive that now has been opened in my own name at the Hoover Institution because I collected a lot of letters that repatriates and some emigres gave me. Some of those letters are immediately not to Harbin, but they are written among repatriates the first few years that they were in the Soviet Union. And there are also in the Khabarovsk archive, there are also in the Lichny Fund of one particular Harbinka, her letters to her fiance that are extremely instructive.
And so once again, in terms of access for Harbinsi or researchers who are interested from abroad, this is something that requires a trip there, which is not possible now anyway, right. Or these archives are somehow responsive electronically.
Khabarovsk is, I would recommend not only do you contact them by email, but you also have a follow-up call. I always do that to Russian archives. And they will scan for a price. And Khabarovsk, of course, is home to the Brem archive, Brem being the semi-monarchist, semi-fascist Russian emigre organization that the Japanese let semi-run the Russian population from 34 to 45. So anybody who has family from Harbin, if you're interested in tracing your family, the Russian emigres have them every year fill out these forms, genealogical, all education records, employment records. And I know that Harbinsi throughout the world contact the archive, send them money through Western Union or however, and you can get access to those.
Well, since we are on the topic of archives, maybe we could address the general question of even in the last few weeks since we've been discussing this, and having no family who went through Harbin, I'm suddenly finding among friends and relatives here on the East Coast in our little village materials related to Harbin, both in my father's bookshelf related to the church in China, books published there at the time, and people with books published in Harbin, for example, in 1934 in their libraries, things like that, and there are many people who are saying that they had family who went through there in the chat. So what happens to these archives? Can you just briefly explain why it's so important that, for example, in Australia, unfortunately, many of these archives disappeared. And then I know that the situation in Russia was complicated and has become better. And what's going on here, and what should people do? And is all of this of interest to you?
Yeah, well, they should contact Anatol Shmelyov, who's right here with us. It's where I send anybody who has family papers on Russians to do with Russians in China, simply because the Hoover Archive started in the 1920s buying materials from prominent emigres in China. The diaries of Ivan Serebrennikov, for example, some of which are published. So the Hoover, and then the Hoover, because most of the Russians who came to the United States from China went to San Francisco, was the natural home. So it is where the majority of materials already are. And if you're interested in helping for future historians of China, you don't want them running all over the world to look at various archives. It's great if they come to the US and they can go mainly to the Hoover Archive. These letters that I collected, it's why I wanted them to go to the Hoover, because I didn't feel the Repatriates' voices were as representative as the emigres. But I hear from people periodically, and I send them to Dr. Shmelyov. And they find a wonderful home. And the Hoover is the most user-friendly archive I've ever worked in. They even let you work in uncatalogued archives. Amazing. Before they're actually cataloged.
And for anyone who's listening from Russia or who has relatives in Russia who might have such papers, which is the best place in Russia for these papers to go to?
Oh, in Russia now, archives are very much interested. There are, repatriates have given their papers, especially if they're from prominent families, but now archives are interested in pretty much anybody from China. So your local archive can be a good place. Garth in Moscow is another one. They, of course, have most of the Prague archive, which was stolen by the Red Army in '45 from Prague, and which had quite a few materials of Russians, emigres from China who had been sending their materials there.
We have a number of specific and interesting questions, so if I might turn to those now from listeners. Has anyone covered the large Russian emigre colonies in other Chinese areas like Tsingtao and Shenzhen? They were more affluent than Harbin or Shanghai.
So in terms of Xinjiang, right? Was it?
Oh yes, pardon my pronunciation.
Right, okay, so
but yes.
Right, that's where the Uyghurs now are. We hear about it all the time, right? But what is amazing about the Russian diaspora there, the Russian colony there, is they're hard to find. Even, I mean, I have studied repatriates all over the Soviet Union. I'm interested in anyone from any part of China. I have yet to be able to interview someone. I do know a number of Jehovah's Witnesses, Baptists. There were large sectarian communities who went to Australia, but were not allowed out until the mid '60s from there. It was a difficult place to get out of. You had to get all the way to Shanghai to leave. So a lot of the people there did repatriate. In terms of histories, there are a few in Russian. No English language ones. So there are some historians who have looked at it. There is one particular scholar, and she wrote a doctoral dissertation on it and has published a book. But in terms of, in Russia today, lots of scholars are interested. So if anything's going to come up for particular cities, but I don't know of any besides Kuluj, the city, the Russian city there, Tianjin, Shanghai, and of course Harbin.
Now there's another question you addressed in part in your talk, but that once the Harbins returned to the Soviet Union, it was in some extent hard for them to carry on their diaspora as a group because they were spread out. But were most of them in the Soviet Far East, or did many go to European Russia as well? Was there some particular way in which they were spread out, or did the Soviets on purpose spread them far apart?
Okay, so the last group, the 100,000 that leave starting in 1954, they were able to go where they wanted. They went to, if you went the first couple years, which the majority did, 54, 55, you went first to the state farm. Most people tried to get out of there as soon as possible. Some people stayed as little as a month. So they tended to go to the same cities. So you see chain migration, just like it operates in with migration. So in the case of Chelyabinsk, one young man who'd been studying at the Polytechnical Institute in Harbin went to Chelyabinsk, got himself admitted to their Polytechnical Institute. The dean there had heard of Harbin Technological Institute. He said, bring all your friends. So he wrote to all of his friends at all the state farms, and you end up with several hundred Harbinsi living in Chelyabinsk. Same thing happened with Novosibirsk and Omsk. These are the largest areas. Where they go are mainly the Urals and Siberia. This is not because they are exiled there. It's because these are the areas where their families were from. Most of the Russians who end up in Harbin are from these areas, which makes sense geographically. And in some cases, families meet up with grandparents, meet up with uncles and aunts.
And another question is, how many Harbinsi emigrated to the Philippines?
None. Some made it to Shanghai because they fled in 45. They didn't emigrate there, but they did get out through Tubabo with the Shanghai Russians, because so we had a number of people who feared arrest by the Soviet government in 45. Most people were too trusting, and the Soviets said they had issued an amnesty and they believed them. But some did make it to Shanghai and then came out through Tubabo with the other Russians from Shanghai.
We actually have a couple of questions related to Shanghai. Some stem from the former presentation, and one is one that I received from a friend on Facebook. So the cathedral, I'll read from the questions. The cathedral in Harbin has been transformed into a museum, but I was surprised to learn that there was another in China, namely Shanghai. I was in Shanghai in early November 2019 and regret not even knowing about the existence at any point of a Russian Orthodox cathedral there. Does it still exist, even if only as an architectural curiosity, as in the case in Harbin? And then from the second listener, so when you talked about Harbin in the 1920s and 30s, you said that there were either 20 or 22 Russian churches in the city. Does anyone know how many churches there were in Shanghai? So essentially the same question.
I don't have the exact number on Shanghai. I think the cathedral in Shanghai is still standing. I'm almost 100% sure I've seen it in Russian documentaries. But I do know there is a working church in Shanghai because of the Shanghai consulate, right? And so it's had a priest there for some time. In terms of the situation in Harbin, the St. Sophia's, which was a museum, is now a working church. They have a Chinese Orthodox priest as of 2018, and this is the first time Harbin has had an Orthodox priest since 2000, when their last Chinese Orthodox priest, who had been trained at the Peking mission by Russians, he died. The Moscow Patriarchy is not happy with this. They want to send a Russian priest. But I do want to just mention, in terms of the St. Sophia's, was indeed a museum for a while. And what I found, I don't know if you find this strange, but I found it strange. What they did was they had replicas of every single one of the Harbin churches that had been destroyed. And so you would walk around and look at the replicas. And I think it even included the replicas of some of the churches that were simply not, they had not allowed to be open. Today, there is another museum. It's a real museum of Russian Harbin, and I couldn't download it, but I did see it on their when I went through a virtual tour, and they have at least one of those replicas in there. And they also have, plastered figures of people who look Russian, drinking from a samovar. And so it's mainly for Chinese tourists. As far as I could tell, all of the signature in the museum, all the plaques, were in Chinese. So Harbin has become a real tourist mecca for Chinese tourists as China becomes wealthier and Chinese enjoy tourism. And this is in stark contrast to, say, 10 years ago, when the Chinese were still not willing to admit that Russians had founded the city. And the Polytechnical Institute, for example, you could go to their webpage and it would not say that Russians had founded it. It now does. So there's been a change, and there's also been the mayor of Harbin has been working with Omsk, which the remaining largest diaspora of repatriates still exists, about 300 of them. And he has invited and paid for trips of repatriates to stay even at the Hotel Modern, which is a very expensive hotel. So there's a change in relations, and it seems to be because they want to encourage trade and tourism.
Fascinating, thank you. We have just a couple of minutes left, so if you don't mind, I'll ask the two last questions so you can paste the answers. One is mine, and maybe there's just a quick answer. I'm fascinated now hearing so much about the emigration to China. If the Harbins, even though you said they were not in Russia very big churchgoers, but nonetheless, whether the repatriation of the emigration from China has anything to do with the really great reverence in Russia for St. John of Shanghai.
Well, anybody who is from Shanghai, I always, when I interviewed them, I would bring the bottle of oil from San Francisco, from where he's venerated, or the little bottles that they give out at that, and also little icons, small icons of him. He's very much revered by them. Many of them knew him, or at least those that I interviewed in 2012. In general, half of the bishops all of the bishops except for St. John repatriated. And half of the priests in China repatriated. So among the older generation, they did very much continue their belief, and even go to church. And they sometimes played a central role in being like the starosty at the churches and the church treasurer. But they were retired, so they weren't afraid of losing their jobs. Harbinsi, I don't think they have as much of a tie to Father John. Mm-hmm. There's a little bit of disconnect between the Harbinsi and the Shanghaitsi in Russia today. Those that survived, Shanghai is seen as more of a Western city, and they often, when they get together, would like to sing English songs, and Harbinsi don't really like that because they see themselves as having been the real Russia. And then Shanghaitsi look at them as if they're provincial. So in Ekaterinburg, where you had very large numbers of both groups, they were always together, and they had a newspaper together, but there was some tension there.
And an important question is, how much contact was there between the Russians in Harbin and the Russian Jews in Harbin? If so, what has been written about this?
Yes, so there was contact, there were intermarriages, unfortunately, and I promise next year talk about because all of the national minorities from the Russian Empire were in China, and there was a lot of intermarriage, just as there was a lot of intermarriage in Tsarist Russia. So among the Jews, there were some Jews who stayed really very separate. Jews were one of the only other groups from the Russian Empire that had their own primary and secondary school. But on the other hand, though, they were Russian speaking, so they met at cultural events, right? The commemoration of Pushkin's, in 1937, right? That's a big year, and Pushkin, of course, is father for all of them. Has anything been written specifically about Russian Jews? Not really. There is still being printed in Israel today in 3 languages, in Russian, Hebrew, and English, a bulletin, a newsletter. You can go to their site so look up Russian Jews from China. And I bring this up because it's still published in Russian. So these Russian Jews who left Harbin in the mid-50s, it's still their primary culture, and they remain separate to some extent in Israel. But I would say that topic really awaits its scholar.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Laurie, thank you very much. And reminder again, we will have a program in January or February, and much of this, there's so much material to cover. This will be returned to in greater depth. And the questions about architecture in particular in Shanghai, Katya Knyazeva is going to come back to us with a story about that. So I personally look forward to that as well. Grisha, you're back
Sure.
to you.
Thank you. A huge thank you to our presenters today. And of course, thank you to all of the attendees for spending some time with us this afternoon. We will return to the presentations momentarily, but just a bit of housekeeping first. I noticed that everyone's using the Q&A feature. Many of you are. If you have any questions, please, just a reminder, direct them to the speakers using that Q&A feature of Zoom, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you look into the chat area, you'll notice that I placed a link. It's a link which you can click on to donate to the Russian Nobility Association. Your generous donations allow us to continue our charitable work, as well as to bring you fascinating lecture content like what we are listening to today. As many of you know, the Russian Nobility Association is a charitable organization that embraces philanthropic and genealogical aims. The association directs donations to organizations which provide food, shelter, and medical treatment for disadvantaged persons around the world. And among our other programs, our lecture series supports the Prince Alexis Shcherbatov Scholarship Fund. So any amount you can share is welcome, whether it's $20, $50, any amount. Rest assured your donation will be put to good use. So now I'll turn it back over to the presenters who will continue today's lecture. Thank you very much.
So, Sophia, let's continue with the Q&A.
Yeah, so there's a question. First of all, I believe, Alexandra, that you had a question that you wanted to ask.
Yes, well, go ahead, ask the first question.
Okay, then. Well, there's an issue related to Kolchak and the Civil War that comes up a great deal in Russia. And I remember in the 90s, it was one of the biggest questions, the issue of the Tsarist Gold that disappeared. And so one of our listeners has asked, has anyone addressed this issue? And could it have made a difference in financing the white movement? There have been a number of books and films that deal with this, but no one has contributed a full tracing, as there were many stories. And the listener adds that my grandfather contributed to the Czech army out of his gold mine holdings, which paid for his family to leave in their own compartment with provisions when General Sirova came to him and told him of Kolchak's execution.
All right, well, yeah, the gold reserve issue has been the subject of a great deal of interest and discussion, and everybody wants to know where the hidden treasure is. And indeed, there have been a lot of theories about gold being buried in various places in Siberia and the Far East and so forth. There's actually quite a significant literature on it, but I wanted to show you one book because I can't answer the question in great detail simply for the amount of time that we have. This is a book by Oleg Budnitsky called Деньги русской эмиграции, Kolchakovskое золото. This is the most significant, the most meaningful, and the most thorough examination of this whole question. So Oleg Budnitsky, this book is definitely the one worth pursuing. There are other books. Another author who's written a great deal on this question is a fellow named Vladlen Sirotkin. Here are 4 of his books. But this is just awful. Awful. This is worthy only of the garbage. And the only reason I keep it on my shelves is if I ever need a reason to motivate myself to write something, is I look at the garbage that comes out and I feel obligated to write things to clear the record. And Sirotkin, interestingly enough, he was a professor of the Diplomatic Academy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So presumably a high-level position, but in terms of research, absolute garbage. So Budnitsky, by all means read Budnitsky. So a better and more productive answer is, what we're talking about is the gold reserve that was kept in Kazan and was captured by the whites in 1918 and consisted at that time, and we don't really know, we don't have the exact figures, because the way it was captured, there were already, the boxes were broken open, there had already been some looting taking place, and so it was well over 600 million golden rubles that were captured by the whites, which ultimately ended up in Kolchak's hands. And then when the gold reserve was taken by the Bolsheviks in 1920, there were only about 400 million rubles left. So really the question is about this approximately 235 million gold rubles. Where did they go? So, and Budnitsky's book addresses this issue, and it's an important question because the money was obviously used for various purposes. We know we can account for probably the bulk of it. We can't account for all of it, and especially since we don't know the exact figures, and we don't even know. I mean, the Bolsheviks reported that they received 400 million rubles, but who knows, how much was really there, and maybe there were other channels that some of this money went through. But let's go back to that figure of 235 million golden rubles. A good deal of it was used, again, Kolchak's government was not recognized. So purchases of arms, ammunition, supplies from abroad had to be made by using this gold. Now, here was the problem. Kolchak was confronted with a situation, we talked about this last time, where he didn't want to make decisions for the future Russian government. He felt that his role and the role of the white movements was to bring Russia to a new national or constituent assembly, and that this constituent assembly would decide the future of Russia, and he would hand over all of his authority and all of the gold to the constituent assembly for them to use, because they would be the elected, legitimate government, and he was just a temporary placeholder who was trying to bring Russia to this place. And for that reason, he was always loath to use these funds even to promote his cause. And it was really with great difficulty that the funds were pried out of him to send abroad, either for direct purchase or for use as collateral on loans to purchase necessary supplies. And the funds that were sent abroad, in some cases, were captured by the various Ottomans and ended up used for various purposes beyond what they were intended for. They were also sent to the bank in Vladivostok for safekeeping. Again, some of this stuff simply fell into other people's hands. And in some cases, we can actually trace the route. There was a fairly large amount, I couldn't name it right now, but that was deposited in a Japanese bank, and that representatives of the whites were never able to get a hold of again. So it sort of remained in the hands of the Japanese. And there were other amounts that could never be accounted for. A lot of ink has been spilled blaming the Czechs for stealing a large portion of these funds. And in fact, it was considered that the Czech economy was built, the economy of independent Czechoslovakia, interwar Czechoslovakia, was built using these funds. We can't know that for certain. There was plenty of other stuff to steal besides the gold reserve in Siberia. There were all those supplies in Vladivostok and other towns and along the railway. And we know from the descriptions of participants in the campaigns that the Czechs took everything that wasn't nailed down. And it wasn't just the Czechs. Obviously, everybody was looting on the way out. And there was plenty of other things to steal. Also, gold was still being produced during the Civil War. So beyond what we have in the gold reserve, just as our listener mentioned, there was other gold being produced in the course of the Civil War, and not just gold. Siberia is very rich in various other resources. There's platinum, there's silver, beyond the obvious grain, timber, and so on and so forth. So, so as far as the gold reserve goes, again, I recommend this book by Budnitsky as being the best single explanation. And he uses the archives of the Hoover Institution, the Bakhmetyev Archive in New York, as well as the Russian Archive at Leeds University, which also has some really key documents, as well as, of course, Russian archives and various other archives. Very significant book and highly recommended. One other book that I'd really like to recommend is probably the best book on the Civil War in Siberia by Jonathan Smeal. I've already mentioned his name. This book was published in 1996, and this is certainly the most definitive book. This is almost 700 pages. You can see how thick it is. And even that doesn't cover everything. I mean, it's hard to expect us in the course of just, a couple of hours to try and cover territory that other historians have spent 700 pages covering. So forgive us for that. But basically, if you want to learn learn more, that's the most significant book, Jonathan Smeal's Civil War in Siberia. But there are a lot of other great books. There are books on U.S. intervention. There's a book that I reviewed recently by Colonel House. I don't remember the title, but also an excellent book on U.S. intervention in the Russian Civil War. So there's actually a lot of good literature out there, but there's also a lot of bad literature, unfortunately. You have to be a little bit careful. If anybody wants any additional guidance, feel free to write to me directly. I'll be happy to answer. So I'll leave my answer at that.
Thank you so much. And now I believe that Alexander had a question that he wanted to address to you.
Yes, and thank you. And that was based also on questions submitted earlier. But as a summation of these questions, what, from the point of view of really the United States, what was the United States policy? What was the United States really doing there? In particular, with vis-a-vis the role of the Trans-Siberian Railroad and its economic value as a thing in itself.
Yeah, great question. And this has been a topic that's been debated by historians for many decades now. So the standard view is that President Woodrow Wilson did not want to intervene in the Russian Civil War at all. He felt it was strictly Russian business. He didn't want to get involved. And it took a great deal of effort for him to actually make the decision to get involved. And George Kennan, who was a prominent American diplomat, has written a 2-volume study of how this decision was made, just covering the period from 1917 to essentially August of 1918, when the decision is made to intervene. And the standard view states, well, there are various aspects to the standard view, but the main thing is that, number one, there was concern over Japan's influence in the region. And the fact that Japan was much more interested in intervening, and that there had to be some sort of counterbalance to Japanese intervention. The other aspect is the possibility of the reestablishment of the Eastern Front against Germany in the course of 1918. Up until the armistice, it was still hoped and expected that Russia might be brought back into the war in some manner. And so this was another hope that, Woodrow Wilson ultimately, I don't think that he felt that it was, very realistic, but there was extreme pressure on him coming from the French and the British, because what happens in the late spring and summer of 1918 is a major German offensive. And the Germans reach the Marne River, and this scares the French tremendously. And they begin, asking for all sorts of aid and assistance. And one of the possibilities, again, is the reestablishment of the Eastern Front, which this period, again, it coincides with the Czech uprising in May and June of 1918. And so there's hope that maybe, based on the Czechoslovak legions, we can reestablish the Eastern Front. So this is another aspect of the intervention. Of course, there's yet another aspect, which is American interests in Siberia, in the Far East, in China, and so forth. And even prior to the World War, there was an effort, I believe, led by Averell Harriman, who at that time prominent American tycoon, to purchase, I think it was the southern line that runs off the Chinese Eastern Railway at Harbin to Peking. So definitely there were American interests, economic interests, financial interests out there that also needed to be supported. So ultimately what happens is that Wilson, for this broad variety of reasons, acquiesces and orders intervention to take place. Now, in the 1960s, there was a revisionist viewpoint that came into prominence, and this revisionist viewpoint put the primary emphasis on the struggle against Bolshevism, that Bolshevism was an evil to Woodrow Wilson, and he wanted to see it destroyed, and this was the primary reason for US intervention. There are a lot of problems with this theory, but basically it came to prominence later. And so there are competing schools of research on this issue. What happens when the US intervenes is that a general named William Graves is appointed commander of the US Expeditionary Force. And he's given orders to be very careful not to involve himself in domestic Russian politics, but just to guard the railway, to guard that lifeline, and to make sure that US interests, US lives, including the diplomats who were present in various areas in the Far East and in Siberia, as well as general US commercial interests, are also protected. So a lot of historians have looked at General Graves's memoirs and never really judged them very critically. The Bible is criticized more than General Graves's memoirs have ever been by scholars. And I think this is a big mistake because Graves had a lot of things going on that he doesn't mention explicitly in his memoirs. One of the interesting things about Graves is that in 1937, he writes a congratulatory telegram to Stalin on the 20th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. So he's not exactly as neutral as one might expect. And as historians have painted him based on his memoirs. So I think this is a figure that definitely needs to be reevaluated by historians to begin with. But his policy is try not to get involved in Russian domestic affairs. But what that essentially means is that in many areas where the US forces were maintaining order, these became hideouts for the partisans, the guerrillas who were opposed to Kolchak. And the atamans and other Russian officials recognized this, and it caused enormous tension, enormous friction with the American forces. And even Kolchak at one point says that if the Americans aren't going to help us, they should get out. He's that angry at the form that this intervention has taken. And so ultimately these tensions were resolved, and eventually General Graves actually travels to Omsk, and together with the US ambassador to Japan, who was the head of the diplomatic mission out there, Roland Morris, well, the US ambassador was much more gung-ho about supporting Kolchak than Graves was, but basically they try to see what can be done to help support Kolchak. But by that time, it's too late. We're talking about August 1919, and already the White armies are in retreat. So it's a very complicated issue. A lot of literature has been written on this question, and I can only really sort of give you a generic answer right now.
Thank you. And we have a question which maybe Laurie could answer about the Russian community in San Francisco. Is it primarily Harbins or Shanghai? I mean, Shanghai, or is it Harbins as well? Is it a mix of both?
It's a mix of both. Of course, the majority of Shanghaiцы who came to the US went to San Francisco, but numerically, Shanghaiцы are a smaller group, right? So there were 25,000 Shanghaiцы living in Shanghai in 1935. And by the way, most of them were displaced Harbiners. Harbinci, there were over 100,000. So they seem to mix well. The Museum of Russian Culture is really in the Russian Center in San Francisco. San Francisco being the only part of the U.S. Russian diaspora I know, which is has a secular center, right? So of course there are always the churches, but there's also this secular institution of the Russian Center that also has a newspaper. And a daycare center and an archive and a museum, right? And so that museum was founded by Harbinci right after the war, and they remain very active. Very few of them are still alive, unfortunately, but their children are. Anatoly is very active with the museum. But generally from what I get, the sense I get from the 50s and the 60s, those early years was people were very, very much wanted to stay in touch with people they had known in China. And that's something that makes a lot of sense. And so I think these sort of networks of friends developed based on whom you had known. And in some cases, it might be somebody, they might be Shanghaiцы, but they knew each other in Harbin. So again, I think that thinking of Harbin and Shanghai as separate, the way maybe they do in Russia today, doesn't really work simply because there were very few Shanghaiцы that hadn't lived at some point in Harbin unless they were born there.
And there's a question, I think, based on what you just said about the San Francisco Russian Centers. are there any members with access to the San Francisco archives for research purposes? So I guess what is the accessibility of those archives for research?
So, okay, so if you go onto the museum's website, it has a website in English and Russian. You can email them, and they do have employees there, mainly volunteers. They have part-time employees, and they would be happy to help you. I think because of COVID, the museum and archive may still be closed, but regularly they have office hours on or open on Wednesday and Saturday several hours, but you can make queries to them at any time.
Thank you. And there's another question for Anatol, which relates to the previous discussion about what is civil war. One moment, please. Yes. So we were taught in Soviet school, this is the listener writing in, that the Civil War lasted from 1918 to 1921. However, in various sources, one can find completely different dates for the ending of the Civil War, including 1921, 1922, and even the mid-1920s. So if one writes an article not specifically related to the Civil War, but on Russian culture of that period, what would be the most correct, commonly accepted date right now to include as the dates of the Civil War, 18 to 21 or 18 to 22? What would it be?
Well, that's part of the problem, is that nothing that's commonly accepted in the past is commonly accepted anymore by anyone. I mean, if you look around the world around you, everybody's questioning everything. And certainly the dates of the Russian Civil War have already also been brought into question. The real issue is who picks certain dates and why. And obviously, the answer is that these dates are picked for ideological reasons. I think I touched on this in my last talk, which was that the Soviet government had always been insistent that the Civil War really begins in 1918, mid-1918. In a sense, there's an argument to be made for that, because that's when the Eastern Front is formed and the battles really begin and everything sort of lights up, the whole country ignites. But in reality, the white movement had existed before then. It began just about a week or so after the Bolshevik overthrow. So we're talking about the white armies being formed already in November of 1917. This would be the date that I choose, because again, it all depends on how you define civil war. If you define a civil war as trained, organized military units fighting real set piece battles for a particular goal, let's say control over territory, or the installation of their government as the main government of a country, then you could choose this date, because what happens in November 1917 is the Bolsheviks overthrow the provisional government, which had been legitimate, and begin rule themselves in an unlegitimate manner. And this brings out an opposition which wants to ultimately reestablish the Constituent Assembly, which was also elected in November of 1917, met for one day in January of 1918, and was run out by the Bolsheviks. So it kind of builds on this. But again, why the Soviet government chose 1918 also goes back to, it takes the guilt off of the Bolsheviks in 1917, right? Because if you consider the Civil War's beginning in 1917 as a result of the Bolshevik overthrow, and then you take into account that it led to these massive casualties and more deaths through famine and disease than even the casualties in the actual Civil War, then the blame falls on the Bolsheviks, because they started it. They took power. Nobody asked them to do it, right? And obviously, when you take power, you're going to have an opposition movement develop. There's no question about that. And so they're the authors of the Civil War, and they're responsible for all the atrocities ultimately. So the Soviet government didn't want to have that in the schools. And that's why they put it on the Czechs and the Slovaks. Oh, they had an uprising in May. It's their fault. It's the outside, the intervention forces that caused the Civil War. It wasn't us. We didn't have anything to do with it. It's the intervention forces that caused it. It's the Westerners. And so this really built into Soviet ideology. And this is, this is the essential point to be made there. So it's all questions of definitions, and definitions are in many cases ideologically motivated.
Well, actually, I've seen, unfortunately, I don't have this in front of me. It's just something that came to mind after what you said. But in that exhibition, Россия моя история, if that's what it's called, the big multimedia exhibition that Bishop Tikhon Shevkunov created. I don't know if you've seen that, but you've probably heard of it. When discussing the Civil War, there's a quote, presented in some fabulous multimedia format, of someone who had been an anti-Bolshevik, but who in the end says, we in the end have to thank the Bolsheviks because in all this chaos, they were the only ones who in the end managed to bring things under control and reconstitute the Russian state, something along those lines. So that was a view that's being presented currently in Russia.
Yeah, I hadn't read that. I hadn't seen the exhibit. I once tried to visit it, but it was closed that day. So, but basically, this is also the line that the former Minister of Culture, Vladimir Medinsky, pursues. It's essentially the same thing. So it's very much a part of present-day ideology as well.
Thank you very much for that answer. We do have a few more questions, so we still have time, I understand, to get to those. First of all, someone is asking about any Kolchak descendants in San Francisco because they ran across the name in the archive at the Russian Center there, an application from an Arkady Kolchak to join the U.S. National Guard. Is that a relative of the admiral?
I know that descendants are around in the Bay Area, but I don't know any of them personally.
Okay, thank you. And I'm curious too, just as a journalist in Russia today, what all of this that happened in the Russian Far East and the Civil War and all the interrelations with China and with Japan, what impact does that have on Russian policy today? I mean, is that very alive in the minds of Russian military policymakers from what you can see?
I guess it is. I don't really study current affairs very much. I'm kind of trapped in the past. So I couldn't say, but obviously geography doesn't change. And so any government that inhabits the territory of the Russian state as it was 100 years ago or today, or 120 years ago, is going to have to pursue similar policies and will have similar concerns. Now, having said that, a lot of other things do change. Technology, and armaments and so on and so forth. And the fact, of course, that Japan doesn't actually have a military force should be considered a significant factor. I mean, the real military force in the Asia-Pacific region, well, there are two, of course, is China and the United States. And I imagine that planners in Moscow are take these two countries into account much more directly than they do Japan. So Japan's role in the area is more limited, but it's also much larger in the economic sphere than it is in the military sphere. So hopefully that answers your question.
And one more, if possible, about something you mentioned in great detail in the previous lecture, but today as well, the Kolchak's thoughts on the Baltic, on the fleet there, and on the fact that Finland and the Baltic states need to remain within Russia's control. So I realize that you said you don't study Russian policy so much today, but nonetheless, because it's related to Kolchak, have you seen whether his name is specifically invoked today in Russia to justify that? Sort of a larger Russian.
It was in the 1990s, and in fact, his major article on the subject was republished in Morskoy Zbornik, and he's considered to be an important thinker along these lines. But going back to the period that Kolchak was getting his education and his first naval experience, the popular theory at that time was Alfred Thayer Mahan's work on naval history and naval strategy, which involved control of the seas. And really, the fleet was the major way in which you could project your force globally. across the seas and into other continents. Nowadays, you've got long-range bombers, you've got ICBMs, you know, now we have outer space lasers, and I guess coming in, you know, for the future, and all sorts of other things. But at that time, it was the Navy. The Navy was the single way in which you could project your country's great power status into other lands. And for a landlocked, primarily empire like Russia, the Navy was particularly important, and it was based in the Baltic. And that's why Kolchak was so focused on that region. That's why it played such an important role in the decisions that he was making. So, but nowadays, of course, you know, an aircraft carrier can't even float properly in the Eastern Baltic, in the government in the Gulf of Finland, because there's too much displacement, the water displacement, I mean, and so they just don't fit there. So so for Russia, the Baltic Sea doesn't have that same significance as it did previously. And in general, the issue of Russia having a navy, this is a question that entranced thinkers in the 19th century as it does today, and the question is, to what extent does Russia need a huge navy, or does it just need shore protection? This is something that both scholars and naval theorists and naval commanders discuss constantly. You know, what sort of navy does Russia need? It was a question that Kolchak tried to answer in his day in the late 1907, when he published his major article, and it's a question that still involves a lot of thinking.
Thank you very much. And perhaps one last question. A listener is well, referring to his personal family history, but asking for some clarification about history and Russia today. So he asks or says, my grandparents returned to Russia on Kolchak's call for support. He was appointed by General Dietrich to serve on the final Vladivostok Duma. I take it that the failure of the final days was the abandonment of the area by the Japanese. The failure was also the inability of Russians to have a common understanding of what they wanted to be. Is there a current feeling today in Russia to determine what they want to be?
You know, that's a great question. There is definitely an attempt to formulate a common view and a common vision, and that part of Russian history that Archbishop, no, he's a metropolitan now, isn't he? Tikhon Shevkunov created. This is one of the ways in which this is done. But you know, just as we heard today, I mean, even in the Maritime District at that time, you had the Semyonovцы at odds with the Kapilevцы, commanded by General Molchanov. They weren't pursuing the same interests. What Laurie was talking about, you've got the Harbins and the Shanghaiцы, and they have their own interests and their own tensions between them. You know, there's the anecdote about Russian emigres, that if you have a Russian emigre on a deserted island, he builds two churches, one to go to and the other one to rail against. So, well, I mean, you can't expect Russians to always agree with each other. I don't know if you can expect any nationality to always agree with each other, but Russians seem to have a particular propensity to engage in this sort of tension and friction where it's not absolutely necessary.
Well, on this very general conclusion about Russians, this would lead to further discussion, I'm sure, in the future. And as I mentioned, in January, February, we'll return to this part of the world and look again at how to be in Shanghai. But for now, we're out of time. So I'd like to thank our panelists, our participants, our moderator, and all the participants in this first inaugural season of virtual lectures that the Russian Nobility Association has produced. And we look forward to welcome you all back. In September, October, we'll start with the return to Constantinople, and then we have many other subjects planned. So thank you all very much. Have a great summer, and we look forward to seeing you in the fall.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.